Griffin Strickland lifted the engraved invitation off the kitchen island, read it once, and set it back down. Not on the counter, not in the stack of mail by the door, but in the recycling bin beneath the counter, with the quiet efficiency of a man disposing of something that no longer had a use. Maeve's name was printed on it in gold ink, his wife's name, and he put it in the recycling without a word, without a call, without so much as a note left on the refrigerator. 19 years of marriage, gone in less time than it takes to recycle a piece of paper. He didn't hesitate. He didn't look over his shoulder to check if she'd noticed. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, picked up his phone, and called his project manager. "Bryn," he said when she answered. "Change of plans for Thursday. You're coming to the awards night with me. I'll need someone who knows the Hartwell Group personally." What Griffin Strickland did not know, what he had never once stopped to ask, was that the woman whose name he had just dropped into that bin had held in 3 of the Hartwell Group's signature properties. Not as a consultant, not as a reference. As the founder of the studio that had transformed those buildings into the most photographed interiors in Western Canada. Drop your city in the comments right now, and if this is your first time here on Ivory Secrets, welcome. You are going to want to stay for this one. Maeve Strickland was 47 years old, and she had spent most of those years being exceptionally good at being invisible. Not because she lacked presence. Anyone who had ever sat across from her in a real conversation would tell you she was one of those people who made you feel like the only person in a room. But she had learned, the way certain women learn certain things, that in the particular world she shared with Griffin, visible meant inconvenient. Visible meant questions she wasn't ready to answer, and truths she wasn't ready to expose. So she had cultivated a kind of strategic stillness, patient, watchful, and always working. She had grown up in Fredericton, New Brunswick, the second of 3 daughters in a household, where her father restored heritage buildings on weekends, and her mother ran a small antique textile business out of their dining room. There was never a great deal of money, but there was always beautiful detail. The way afternoon light moved across a restored plaster ceiling, the particular weight of linen that had survived 100 years of use and still held its shape. Maeve grew up understanding that beauty is not decoration. It is structure. It is intention. It is the deliberate decision that a space should feel a certain way when a person enters it and hold that feeling long after they leave. She studied architecture at Dalhousie and then interior design at the University of Toronto, and by 29, she had worked her way into one of the most respected firms in the city. She was good at it in the way that made senior partners quietly uncomfortable, the kind of good that arrives, fully formed, and doesn't need the years to catch up. At 31, she left to start her own firm. She called it Aldervale Studio. She structured it, from the very beginning, through a holding company that kept her personal name at a careful distance from the public record. Not out of embarrassment, not out of fear, out of a quality she had inherited from her father, who had always said that the best work speaks before the person who made it does. She wanted Aldervale to speak first. She wanted clients to arrive at the work before they arrived at her. They came. Within 5 years, Aldervale Studio had completed 11 significant projects across Canada and 3 in the Pacific Northwest. Within 10 years, the firm had a portfolio valued in the hundreds of millions, a team of 22, and a reputation in design circles that was passed around in the particular reverent, half-whisper reserved for firms that have done something genuinely difficult to explain but impossible to forget. Within 15 years, Aldervale was quietly considered one of the most influential interior architecture studios in the country. And almost nobody outside of that world knew that the person who had built it was a woman who attended her husband's industry dinners, and said very little and laughed at the right moments, and was generally described by anyone who noticed her at all as Griffin's wife, the one with the good eye for color. She met Griffin Strickland at 33 at a developer's gala in Vancouver, where he had been the most magnetic person in the room and had known it without being obnoxious about it, which she had found, at the time, genuinely impressive. He asked her what she did. She said she was in design. He said he loved design. He meant it the way people mean it when they love the result of a thing without caring at all about how the thing is made. They married 14 months later. The early years were good. Griffin was ambitious and funny, and he looked at her, in those years, like she was interesting. She liked feeling interesting to him. She stepped back from the day-to-day at Aldervale and trusted her team. And she channeled the part of herself that wanted to build into building their life together. The house, in North Vancouver, the garden she planted herself, the dinner parties where she sat at one end of the long table and made sure everything felt right, without anyone noticing how deliberate the feeling was. The first crack appeared 4 years in, at a dinner party at their home. One of Griffin's clients, a man named Howard Peel, who had built his money in commercial real estate and wore that money loudly, was complaining about a renovation project that had gone sideways. "Spent $900,000 on an interior firm," Howard said, shaking his head. "Place still looks like a hotel lobby, no soul. Know what I mean?" Maeve, who had been quiet at her end of the table, said without thinking, "The problem isn't the firm. The problem is the brief. If a client wants something that feels like a home and gives the designer a hotel budget and a 3-month timeline, the designer will give them a hotel. You get back what you put in." The table went quiet. Howard looked at her. He looked at Griffin. He looked at her again, with the particular expression of a man who has been corrected by someone he hadn't been paying attention to and isn't sure what to do with it. "Is that right?" he said, with a smile that was deciding something. Maeve held his gaze. "It is." There was an uncertain pause. Griffin reached under the table and pressed his hand over hers, firm and brief, and said with a smoothness she had always admired, "And Maeve has strong opinions about design. You'll have to forgive her. She can't help herself." The table laughed. The conversation moved on. Later, after the guests had gone, Griffin found her in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher, and said, not unkindly, "Howard is a sensitive guy. You embarrassed him tonight." Maeve set down the glass in her hand. "He spent $900,000 on a renovation without understanding what he was asking for. That's not embarrassing. That's just accurate." Griffin looked at her for a long moment. "Can you just let me handle the client conversations? It makes things easier." "Easier for whom?" she asked. He didn't answer. He went upstairs, and Maeve stood in her own kitchen, in the quiet, and made a decision that would shape the next decade and a half of her marriage. She would stay quiet, not because Griffin had asked her to, because she wanted to understand whether his preference for her silence was a momentary insecurity or something structural. Something about who he fundamentally believed she was supposed to be. She waited. She watched. The answer arrived slowly, the way the worst answers always do. She watched Griffin construct a version of their marriage in public that became less and less connected to the actual person he had married. In interviews, she became my wife. She keeps everything running at home. At industry events, she became the graceful woman at his side who knew everyone's name and remembered their children's schools and made every room warmer without taking up any of the room's attention. At home, her insights became overthinking it. Her professional observations became not really your area, babe. Her achievements, the ones Griffin didn't know about, the ones quietly reshaping the landscape of Canadian design, became completely invisible. She told herself it was a small thing. Then she told herself it again and again, until she had said it so many times it stopped feeling like something she believed and started feeling like something she was reciting. By year 12, Griffin consulted her on nothing. He made business decisions without her input. He chose their social calendar based on his networking needs. He invited people to dinner to close deals and then thanked her afterward for the beautiful table settings. Which was the thing he noticed, because it was the thing he could see. Maeve planted a garden in the years that followed. She grew hostas and dogwood, and the particular variety of climbing, rose her mother had always loved, and she tended it with the same deliberate attention she brought to every project at Aldervale. Patient, systematic, unhurried. Griffin told one of his clients once that they had a landscaper. He believed it. He had never once watched her work. The notification came on a Wednesday evening in October. Maeve was at her desk in the second bedroom she used as a home office, a room Griffin assumed she used for personal projects, which was technically true in the way that describing the Pacific Ocean as a body of water is technically true. When her phone lit up with an email from the Canadian Design Excellence Foundation. She read the subject line once, then she read it again. The foundation was pleased to inform Aldervale Studio that it had been selected as the recipient of this year's Grand Prix, the highest honor in Canadian interior design, awarded once every 2 years to a firm whose body of work had demonstrably and irreversibly raised the standard of the discipline. The award would be presented at the annual Design Excellence Gala in Toronto on November 14th. The foundation hoped the studio's founder would attend in person to accept. Maeve set the phone down on her desk. She looked at the room around her. The bookshelves she had built herself from salvaged Douglas fir, the drafting table her father had given her the year she graduated, the wall of project photographs that Griffin had passed 100 times without asking about. She thought about the invitation with her name on it in gold ink, currently sitting at the bottom of the recycling bin, under the kitchen counter. She thought about Griffin's phone call to Bryn. She thought about 19 years of dinner parties where she had held the fullest version of herself, very still, like something cupped in the hands to protect from wind. She thought about her mother's voice. Her mother, who had run a textile business out of her dining room in Fredericton and been described by every neighbor and acquaintance for 30 years as Bill's wife, the one who makes those beautiful, the clients, the reputations. She had built stitch by careful stitch was simply a hobby that complemented someone else's existence. The work knows what it is, her mother had told her once. You just have to be in the room when it says so. Maeve picked up her phone. She called Asha Mehta. Asha had been Aldervale's director of operations since year 3. She was 39 years old and possibly the most quietly capable person Maeve had ever worked with, a woman who ran the firm's most complex logistics with the focused calm of someone who had long ago decided that panic was simply inefficiency wearing a crisis clothes. I need to be at the gala on Thursday, Maeve said when Asha answered, not as a +1, as myself, as the founder. The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. I'll call David Kurtz, Asha said. David Kurtz was the foundation's director. He had been trying to reach Aldervale's elusive founder for 6 years, had spoken with Asha, with the firm's communications team, with everyone except the woman who actually ran it. He would move considerably more than mountains for this call. Done within the hour, Asha said, then her voice shifting slightly. Maeve, are you all right? Maeve looked out the window at the garden. At the roses she had planted herself, every one of them, in soil, she had amended over 3 difficult seasons, while her husband told clients a landscaper handled the grounds. I'm exactly who I've always been, she said. I just like the room to know it. On the evening of November 14th, Griffin Strickland stood in front of the mirror in his hotel room at the Fairmont Royal York and straightened his tie for the 2nd time and felt the particular electric certainty of a man who believes that tonight everything is going to unfold exactly as he has planned. The Hartwell Group deal was the centerpiece of his career. He had been working the consortium for 16 months, a coalition of institutional investors and development partners whose participation would triple Strickland Development's portfolio and cement his name in the transformation of the Toronto waterfront. 3 of the group's 5 principals were attending the gala tonight. Griffin had positioned himself perfectly. What he did not know, had never known because he had never asked, was that 2 of those 3 principals had been working with Aldervale Studio for years. Judith Nakagawa, the group's senior partner, had commissioned Aldervale to redesign the firm's flagship Vancouver property and had described Maeve in a letter to her own board as possessing a quality of spatial intelligence I have encountered in 30 years of development work, exactly once. Paul Ossie, the group's real estate lead, had met privately with Aldervale's founder 3 times and told his team afterward, each time, that he wanted a formal co-design arrangement on every significant project the Hartwell Group touched going forward. Neither of them had ever connected the name Maeve Strickland to the name Aldervale Studio. They knew her only as the studio's founder, a woman who worked with extraordinary discipline and kept herself carefully out of the public record. Tonight that was going to change. By 8:15, the Grand Ballroom of the Royal York was doing the thing Grand Ballrooms do when you place several hundred people in them who each believe, with complete sincerity, that they are among the most important people in the room. Conversations climbed over each other. Laughter arrived in short, controlled bursts. Social currency deployed carefully, always in the right directions. Griffin moved through it with the fluid confidence of a man who had practiced this exact performance. He knew how to work a room. He knew which handshakes to linger on, which questions to ask about people's children, how to make every person he spoke with feel specifically chosen. Bryn moved beside him with professional ease, filling gaps with the accurate intelligence of someone who had been well briefed. He found Judith Nakagawa at 9:15, silver-haired, unhurried, with the particular stillness that belongs to people who have stopped needing to prove anything, and made his way toward her with the focused patience of a man approaching something he has wanted for a very long time. Judith. He extended his hand with the smile he had spent years calibrating, warm enough to be disarming, confident enough to signal he wasn't trying. "I'm glad you made it tonight." She shook it, firm grip, genuine warmth in her expression carefully measured. "Griffin, good evening." She glanced briefly past him, scanning the room. "Tell me, is your wife here? I've been looking forward to." "Maeve prefers quieter evenings," Griffin said smoothly. "Big industry events aren't really her scene." Judith looked at him for exactly 1 beat, longer than was comfortable. "I see," she said. And then she excused herself with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had just made a small but significant entry in the file she kept on people. She was deciding whether to trust. Griffin didn't notice. He was already looking for Paul Osei. In the back of a black car, 3 blocks from the hotel, Asha Mehta looked at the clock on her phone and then looked at Maeve. "How do you feel?" she asked. Maeve was looking out the window at the November streets. The dark, the streetcar lights, the amber glow of a city that gets beautiful when you stop trying to find it and simply let it arrive. She was wearing a deep green gown she had bought in Montreal 6 months earlier at a small atelier on Rue Saint-Denis during a business trip she had told Griffin was a weekend with her sister, Louisa. She had looked at it on the rack and thought, "I am saving this for a moment that matters." She hadn't known yet what that moment would be. She knew now. She turned from the window. "Like someone who has been holding something very carefully for a very long time," she said, "and is about to set it down." Asha nodded once. She reached across and briefly, firmly pressed Maeve's hand. The gesture lasted 2 seconds. It said everything that neither of them needed to put into words. The car kept moving through the November night. At 9:28, the doors of the Grand Ballroom opened. People who were there would struggle later to describe what happened in the exact moment Maeve Strickland walked in. They would reach for words and find the available ones were either too dramatic or not quite enough. Some said the room went quiet. Some said conversation simply stopped, the way music stops when the needle lifts. Some said they looked up because they sensed something, because the quality of attention in the room shifted, the way a room shifts when something true enters it. What is certain is this. David Kurtz stepped to the microphone at the far end of the ballroom and said, in the deliberate carrying voice of a man who understood the weight of the moment, "Ladies and gentlemen, it is my privilege to introduce the founder of Aldervale Studio and the recipient of this year's Grand Prix, Maeve Strickland." The applause started at Judith Nakagawa's table. Then it moved. By the time Maeve had taken 4 steps into the room, the sound had become something real and full, not the polite, performative applause of people fulfilling a social obligation, but kind that happens when someone arrives in a room. where they have been waited for, without anyone knowing they were waiting. Maeve moved through it with a composure that was almost difficult to look at directly. Not cold, not performed, just settled. The deep, earned calm of a woman who had decided exactly who she was and had arrived to be that person without apology and without anything left to prove. She was 47 years old, and she was the most commanding presence in a room full of people who commanded rooms for a living. And across that room, Griffin Strickland heard his wife's name come out of that microphone and felt the glass in his hand stop halfway to his mouth. Aldervale Studio. He turned. He saw Maeve. What happened to his face in that moment was not something he could have controlled. And for the first time in as long as anyone at his table could remember, he did not appear to want to control anything at all. His expression moved through shock and confusion, and then underneath both of those, something slower and more terrible, the particular look of a man who is beginning, in real time, to understand the actual dimensions of a space he has been living in for 2 decades. A space far larger and far more complex than he had ever allowed himself to see. Bryn touched his arm. "Griffin, are you all right?" He didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on Maeve who was being embraced by Judith Nakagawa with the warmth of a colleague she has wanted to see for months. On Maeve, already in conversation with Paul Osei, both of them leaning toward each other, with the easy fluency of people who have had important conversations before and are glad to be having another. On Maeve, who looked up from that conversation and across the length of the ballroom and found Griffin's eyes without searching for them. She looked at him, no anger, no triumph, no cruelty, just clear, the way a mirror is clear. And Griffin Strickland, for the first time in 19 years, was looking directly into it. The next 30 minutes were the longest of his professional life. He watched his wife move through the room he had spent his career trying to enter, and he watched the room respond to her in a way it had never responded to him, not with performance, not with politeness, but with genuine deference. The kind that arrives when someone enters who people have been wanting to speak to. He tried to continue his own conversations. He tried to maintain the momentum of the evening. But something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of the room, in the invisible but very real structure of attention and significance and weight. And he could feel that structure reorganizing itself around a different center of gravity, around Maeve. At some point, Bryn leaned close and said, very quietly, "Is that your wife?" "Yes," Griffin said. A pause. "She's the founder of Aldervale Studio." "Apparently." Another pause. "Griffin." Bryn's voice was not unkind, but it was completely honest. "I think you may have made a significant miscalculation this week." He didn't respond. She was right. He knew she was right. And knowing it felt like standing on a floor that had just revealed itself to be glass. He crossed the room at 10:12. Not performing this time, not managing anything, or working toward a strategic position. He crossed the room the way a man crosses a room when he has run out of alternatives to honesty, and has decided because there is nothing else left, that honesty is the only ground worth standing on. Maeve saw him coming. Of course she did. She said something brief to the 2 people she was with, and they excused themselves with the gracious discretion of people who recognize a private moment arriving and know to clear space for it. Then she turned to face her husband. They stood 2 feet apart in the middle of the most important professional event of Griffin Strickland's career, and looked at each other in the particular way people look at each other when the performance has finally, completely run out. "Hello, Griffin," Maeve said. Her voice was quiet and completely steady, and it carried in those 3 syllables the full weight of everything she had chosen not to say for 19 years. Griffin opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again. "Aldervale," he said. The word came out lower than he intended, almost unsteady. "How long?" Maeve looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Since before we met." The words arrived on him like cold water. Before they met, before every dinner party, every introduction, Every evening she had sat at the end of his table and said exactly as much as the room would accept from her, and not one word more. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, and the question, for all its plainness, held a genuine anguish that surprised even him. Not the anguish of a man who has been deceived, the anguish of a man who is beginning to understand what he has wasted. Maeve tilted her head slightly, the way she did when she was about to say something precise. "Because I needed to know," she said, "whether you loved me, or whether you loved what my name might have meant if you'd known it sooner." Griffin stared at her. "And now you know," he said. "Now I know," she said. Around them, the gala continued. The music played, the champagne circulated. 800 people performed the rituals of ambition and connection and carefully managed visibility. But in the 2 feet of space between Griffin and Maeve Strickland, everything was completely still. And in that stillness, Griffin heard for the first time in 19 years the true sound of his own silence. It was the sound of every question he had never asked. Every evening he had introduced her as my wife and never once added, and also never once left room for the thing that came after. Every conversation he had redirected because her competence made him feel something he had chosen not to examine. He had spent 19 years not seeing the most extraordinary person in his life, and she had spent 19 years deciding whether he was worth being seen by. Tonight she had given him her answer, not with words, with everything else. The 2 feet of space between them stayed exactly that. "We should talk," he said, properly, "somewhere quieter." She considered him for a long moment, then she nodded once. Not in agreement, exactly, more in the manner of someone who has decided a conversation she has been postponing for years is finally ready to be had. They found a side corridor off the main ballroom, carpeted in dark burgundy, softly lit. He turned to face her. He wanted to begin from somewhere controlled. What came out instead was raw. "How big is it?" he asked. "Aldervale, I need to understand he exhaled, what I was standing next to." Maeve held his gaze. 41 projects across Canada and the Pacific Northwest, 22 employees. 3 international awards before tonight. Revenue last year of approximately $34 million. Each number landed separately. Griffin ran a development firm valued at considerably less. He thought about every room where he had explained why Strickland Development was uniquely positioned to define the next generation of Canadian real estate. He thought about how certain he had been, how complete. He thought about who had been sitting beside him at dinner those nights, listening with that quiet expression he had always read as support. He understood now that it was restraint. "The Hartwell Group," he said. "They know you. Judith and I have worked together twice. Paul has been trying to formalize a co-design arrangement for over a year." She paused. "I didn't come tonight to take your deal, Griffin." "Then why?" "Because you put my invitation in the recycling bin," she said. The words came out clean and direct, without anger, without theater, just the plain, unadorned fact of it. Without a word, without a reason, without so much as a conversation. And I realized that if I let that pass without response, I would be telling myself a story about this marriage that I cannot keep telling. His jaw tightened. He pressed 2 fingers against his mouth briefly. Then, I thought I was protecting something. The evening, the deal, my image. "You were," she said simply. "You just didn't know what you were sacrificing to protect it." That was the sentence that broke something open in him. He felt it physically. Something behind his sternum that he had been holding in a closed fist for years without knowing. His hand was clenched. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He didn't look at it. It buzzed again. He pulled it out. "Bryn. Judith Nakagawa is asking for you. She wants to discuss the Hartwell proposal now." He looked at the text. He looked at Maeve. He looked at the text again. For one strange, suspended moment, he was holding both worlds in his hands. The deal that had been the center of his professional identity for 16 months, and the marriage he was only now beginning to understand. He had been misreading for 19 years. "You should go," Maeve said, simply, without coldness. Just the observation of a woman who understood that Griffin had obligations in that room, and that this corridor conversation, however necessary, would not resolve itself in the next 3 minutes. "We're not done," he said. "No," she agreed, "we're not." He held her gaze for one more beat. Then he straightened his jacket, the automatic gesture of a man putting himself back together, and walked back into the ballroom. Maeve stayed in the corridor a moment longer. She breathed in, she breathed out. She thought about a dining room in Fredericton, where her mother had spread antique linen across a table to catalog it, running her fingers over every thread with the focused attention of someone who understood that the thing in her hands mattered, because she had decided it mattered, regardless of whether anyone else in the room agreed. The work knows what it is. You just have to be in the room when it says so. She went back in. At 11, Judith Nakagawa found Maeve near the awards display, with Paul Ossie beside her, and spoke with the directness of someone who had been waiting to have this conversation all evening. "The Hartwell Group has been watching Aldervale's work for 3 years, Judith said. "We've admired the discipline, the restraint, the way your projects feel inhabited rather than designed." She paused. "We've been looking for a partnership at significant scale. Not a consultancy. A genuine co-creative arrangement across 3 waterfront properties: Toronto, Vancouver, Halifax." The silence lasted 3 seconds. 3 seconds in which Maeve stood very still, and felt the weight of a moment. She had been patient enough not to rush. "Tell me more about what you're envisioning," she said. And the conversation that followed, conducted in a quiet corner of a glittering ballroom, while 800 people performed all around them, was the conversation that would change everything. Not because it was dramatic, because it was real. It was not lost on Maeve that the deal Griffin had spent 16 months positioning himself to close was now, in its most essential dimension, being built around the woman whose name he had placed in a recycling bin 4 days ago. She did not feel vindicated by this. She felt certain and tired, and more completely herself than she had been in years. That was enough. The gala ended at midnight. Griffin was one of the last to leave. He stood near the hotel entrance and watched the staff begin the quiet dismantling of the evening. Tables cleared, flowers boxed, the careful erasure of a night that had felt, when it began, like the most important of his career. It had turned out to be important in ways he had not anticipated. In the car back to the hotel, he did not check his phone. He did not review outcomes or rehearse tomorrow's conversations. He sat in the dark of the back seat and watched the November city move past the window. He thought about what Maeve had said, whether you loved me, or whether you loved what my name might have meant. He was still thinking about it when the elevator opened, and he stepped into the empty hotel room and understood, standing there in his coat, that the silence of this place was different from the silence he had lived in before, because now he knew what had been living inside it all along. He sat at the desk and did something he had not done in a very long time. He picked up the hotel notepad and a pen and he began to write. Not a strategy, not a deal structure. He wrote down every evening he could remember, every dinner party, every event, every conversation where Maeve had said something sharp and true, and he had chosen, without really choosing, to cover it over. His hand on hers at Howard Peel's dinner. The morning she had left an Aldervale project photo on the kitchen counter. A building she had designed. And he had said it looked nice without asking the name of the firm. The night he had given a speech in front of 40 people about the mentors who had shaped his vision, and thanked 3 colleagues by name, while Maeve sat at table 4 and held a glass of wine she barely touched. He filled 2 pages, then a third. Then he put the pen down and sat with what he had written. It was not a list of mistakes, it was a record of choices. Each one small enough to seem harmless in isolation. Each one part of a pattern that, assembled on 3 pages of hotel notepad in the quiet of a Toronto night, looked like exactly what it was. 19 years of not seeing someone. 3 weeks later, after 2 Thursday afternoon conversations at the North Vancouver house, the most honest, of their marriage and also the most difficult, and sometimes both at once. Maeve called her sister Louisa in Fredericton. "I'm all right," she said before Louisa could ask. "I know you are," Louisa said, "but tell me anyway." So Maeve told her about the gala, about Griffin's face when she walked in, about the corridor and the hotel notepad and the Thursday afternoons where Griffin was learning, slowly, imperfectly, the difference between listening and waiting for his turn to speak, about Judith Nakagawa and the Hartwell Group and the partnership Asha was already structuring with their legal team, about the Financial Post piece that had run the Monday after the gala, the one with the headline that had made Asha send a voice note that was 3 seconds of silence followed by a long, slow exhale of relief. Louisa listened to all of it without interrupting, the way their mother had always listened. When Maeve finished, Louisa was quiet for a moment. "Mum would have known exactly what to say about this," she said. "I know what she would have said," Maeve replied. "The work knows what it is," Louisa said softly. "You just have to be in the room when it says so." "You just have to be in the room," Maeve agreed. The silence, after it was warm and full, the particular texture of shared memory of two women who had grown up, watching the same person build something beautiful in a dining room in Fredericton, and be described by the neighborhood for 30 years as someone's wife. "Are you going to stay with him?" Louisa asked. Maeve looked out the window at the garden. The dogwood bare for winter. The roses tied back against the cold, the hostas waiting under their mulch for March. "I don't know yet," she said. "He's trying. And trying is the beginning of something, not the end of it. I'm not going to rush the beginning just because I've waited long enough for it." "That's fair," Louisa said. "I spent a long time being fair to the wrong things," Maeve said. "I'm learning to be fair to myself first." That spring, she planted new roses in the back garden. Griffin came outside without being asked and sat on the low stone wall and watched her work. He didn't offer advice. He didn't redirect the conversation. He just sat in the April afternoon and let the quiet be quiet, and after a while he asked, simply, "What variety is that one?" Maeve looked up. "Blanc double de Coubert," she said. "Old French, white, very fragrant, slow to establish." "Worth the wait?" he asked. She looked at the rose, she looked at him. The question was small, it had more inside it than questions usually do. "Usually," she said. And between them, in the particular way that true things settle between people who have finally stopped being careful with each other, that was enough to begin. There is a certain kind of person who moves through the world quietly, who absorbs more than they say, builds more than they show, knows more than they perform, who has learned through experience or instruction or the long patient discipline of someone who understands exactly what they are capable of to hold that capability in reserve. Not out of weakness, out of a quality that looks like patience from the outside and feels, from the inside, like a decision made every single day to keep the best of yourself for a moment that deserves it. Maeve Strickland had been that kind of person, and then she decided to stop waiting for the world to be ready. Not because the world changed, because she did. And the work, her work, built with 16 years of precision and care, and the particular love that a person brings to something made entirely with their own hands had been in the room all along. She just had to walk in and let it speak.